Hello, everyone, and good evening. And I should perhaps add good afternoon and good morning, depending where you are in the world. It's a pleasure and privilege to welcome several hundred of you virtually to Indiana University and for the kickoff event in this year's Japan Politics and Society webinar series. I'd like to give a particular shout out to all you students out there. My name is Adam Liff, and I'm the director of the 21st Century Japan Politics and Society Initiative here at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies. 21JPSI was launched just 2 years ago with significant and generous seed funding from the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership. So many thanks to CGP for their continued support. Our mission here at 21JPSI is straightforward: to encourage and support research, teaching, and programming on contemporary Japanese politics, social issues, and foreign policy here at Indiana University and around the greater Midwest in particular, but also to serve as a Midwestern hub for the study of contemporary Japan from a social scientific perspective across North America. Since our establishment 2 years ago, we've been organizing an annual speaker series like the event today, national conferences on U.S. Japan Relations, manuscript workshops to support Japan-focused social scientists around America and beyond, and also providing grants to support Indiana University student and faculty research travel to Japan. So please check out our website to learn more and for more information on upcoming webinars, all of which will be free and open to the global public, just like this one. So let's begin tonight's program. It brings me extraordinary pleasure, and indeed is one of the honors of my career, to be able to welcome Professor Ezra Vogel as the kickoff speaker in our first ever webinar. As many of you are undoubtedly aware, Professor Vogel is a legend in the fields of both China studies and Japan studies, not only as a scholar and mentor to generations of students, but also as the former director of both Harvard's program on U.S. Japan Relations and its Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies. If that wasn't enough, beyond Harvard, he was also one of the driving forces behind the National Committee on U.S. China Relations Public Intellectuals Program, as well as the Mansfield Foundation's U.S. Japan Network for the Future. To put it simply, Professor Vogel's academic career is also full of a long list of extraordinary accomplishments, including a number of influential scholarly books, such as Japan is Number One, which became a national bestseller in Japan, Deng Xiaoping and the Transformation of China, which became a bestseller in China, and most recently, in the focus of his talk today, last year's China and Japan Facing History, which you can see strategically placed over my left shoulder somewhere right about there. So, it's a particularly opportune moment to discuss this hugely important bilateral relationship, which is between the world's second and third largest national economies. Not only does 2020 mark the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, it seems like almost every day there's a new headline reminding us of how potentially volatile Asia's geopolitics are. China and Japan are neighbors at the center of it all, and yet, as Professor Vogel writes in his book, the relationship defies simple description. To borrow his words, the relationship is tense, dangerous, deep, and complicated. It is also a relationship that is hugely significant for the United States, but which does not get nearly the attention it deserves. So it is indeed a tremendous privilege to have Professor Vogel with us today to share his views. Before I turn things over to our speaker, I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight one thing that you won't see mentioned on most online bios of Professor Vogel, and that is the tremendous impact he has had as an extraordinarily kind and generous mentor to multiple generations of China and Japan scholars, not only here in North America, but around the world. I consider myself one of the very lucky beneficiaries of his generous counsel and guidance over the years. And here, in this most public of possible settings, I would just like to end my introduction by simply saying, Ezra, thank you so much for everything you have done for all of us. With that all said, let me now get out of the way and turn things over to our speaker. Professor Vogel will offer an introductory lecture on China-Japan relations since 1945, after which I will ask him a few burning questions of my own before opening it up to all of you. So if a question comes up in your mind while he's speaking, please feel free to send it in and we'll keep a running list. At the bottom of the Zoom display, there's a Q&A button. Please try to be concise and let us know where you are watching from. With that, and without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Ezra Vogel.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that overly kind and excessively generous, exaggerated account of my history. I found that in my long history that I developed certain patterns. And one is when I finish a book, I travel around to talk about it. It's not that I expect to make a lot of money anymore when I go to colleges to talk about my book. But it's in a way a sign that I've spent a few years working hard at something, I have something to say, and I'd like to share what I've learned from my study with audiences and get their reaction. Um, I'm particularly happy to be affiliated with Indiana. The original plan was for me to come here. That I was going to travel around after I finished my book last year. I didn't get to Notre Dame in Indiana, but I didn't get to the university. We had planned it, and then we have coronavirus. What I would like to say first is a few words about Indiana, because I've been to Indiana a number of times, and I like a lot. I like the University of Indiana a lot, and I just wanted to pay my tribute to two people who I had the pleasure of know, who played a role in Indiana. One is George Wilson. George Wilson was a professor here for 35 years. For about 15 years, he was in charge of the East Asian Studies Center. And he was a graduate student at Harvard while I was an overgraduate student. After I finished my PhD in sociology, I came back to study Japan and China. While I was back as an overgraduate student, he was here as a graduate student, so we became good friends. And he had a sister, Suzanne Wilson, who was also became good friends. And for 35 years, he was a professor here in Indiana, and I know George, he's a very hardworking, disciplined kind of person who's very dedicated to the subject, who is a very good scholar. And I think he played a great role in Indiana. He passed away 4 years ago at too young an age, but I just wanted to pay tribute to him. The other person, when I was out here lecturing on Japan as number one, I got to sit next to for the evening was Herman Wells. And I think of all the university presidents I've heard about, nobody in a way has had a longer, more dedicated, more interesting career than Herman Wells. As you know, he became president of the University of Indiana in 1938. He continued until when he was only 35 years old. He continued until 1962. And then he was a chancellor here for many years after that. He was a small town Indiana boy, Boone County, and yet like Richard Lugar and Lee Hamilton, he was one of the people who developed very good values in Indiana, and then went on to the outside world and became involved in all kinds of affairs. And he somehow had the vision and the continued effort to make Indiana really a great university. I'm from Central Ohio, and Ohio was in the Big Ten. And we used to think of Indiana as the lower half in terms of all kinds of studies. But I think in international affairs, it was your president who brought you up into the upper half with Russian studies after World War II, and then developed in East Asia. And so I think Herman Wells is really one of the great university presidents, and I just wanted to pay tribute while I was here. What I'm going to talk about today is the period after World War II up until the present time. In 2010, when I finished writing my book on Deng Xiaoping and was around lecturing, I was trying to think what else I wanted to do at that time. And I decided that what I wanted to do was work on China and Japan. The reason was 2010 was just the peak of the worst relations between China and Japan. They were just about fighting each other. A Chinese ship had rammed into a Japanese ship. The Japanese ship was very upset, and the Japanese were being very tough and insisting that they try the captain. And then 2 years later, while I was just getting started, the Japanese nationalized Senkaku, what the Chinese call Diaoyudao. And they were off to extremely tense relation. Sometimes, you know, a scholar who has the good luck of selling a bestseller on Japan in Japan and a bestseller on China in China, I have perhaps it's a dream that I might have some influence in the world. It may not be quite as much as I would hope, But to the extent that I did have influence, I wanted to use it to try to get those two countries working together. I had had a very good time in my field work in Japan, and I've kept going to Japan every year, at least once a year, since 1958. And I first went to China in 73, and since the 80, I've been going to China every year and I have a lot of good Chinese friends. And I really wanted those two countries to do well. I really hope that both of them continue to do well. And I wanted them to get along with each other. If a Chinese wrote a book about Japan, the Japanese would not necessarily take it as the truth. If a Japanese wrote it, the Chinese certainly would not take that as something. But some so-called objective scholar from the United States who liked both countries might have some possibility of having some influence. The Chinese have a saying called 旁观者清, which means sometimes the bystander can see things more clearly. It's not always true. And certainly when I started on the book, I didn't know much about China and Japan history. I was a sociologist who worked on the contemporary era. I knew I'd taken a few history courses, but I was certainly not a specialist. And what I did is I started reading about Chinese and Japanese history since 600. And the reason I was working on history is because the Chinese said, the problem with the relationship with Japan is history. And if they don't acknowledge what happened in history, we can't really improve our relationship and can't really work on it. So I spent 7 years studying the history of those two countries, and this book as a result. I also had the help of two wonderful people, Paula Harrell, who had done much more research on the period from 1895 up to World War II and the Chinese and Japanese exchanges, and also Rick Dyke, who both of them did chapters with me in the book, and they taught me a lot. They're really wonderful scholars. And so what I wanted to talk about today, instead of trying to cover the whole history since 600, in order to provide background on the current events in about 40 minutes that Adam gave me to talk, I want to cover the period after World War II, because I think that period, there are enough things that happened that can give you a sense of the inner feelings that a lot of the people on both sides have toward what we do now. The end of World War II, of course, was a devastating defeat to Japan. Ever since 1895, when they defeated China, 1905, when they defeated Russia, they began to feel pretty strong and pretty capable. And the 1920s and 30s, when they became tense with the United States, they even thought that maybe they could take on the United States, or at least get America to give in quickly and not bother fighting them. And so this small country was really ready to take on the world. And they had developed very great visions of what they could do. And then suddenly they came crashing down with defeat. It is remarkable when you stop to think about it, from 1941 to 45, 3.5 years, while they had a huge army in China, they had a huge army occupying Southeast Asia. This little country at that time of about 70 million people, and held the United States at bay. Of course, we were fighting Europe as well, but still, they held us at bay for 3.5 years. It's remarkable. But then came crashing down with total defeat at the end of 1945, and they were devastated. And a lot of the people that I got to know when I first started going to Japan in the 1950s felt that they'd been misled by the militarists, that they had gotten involved in fighting and puffing themselves up, and that was a horrible thing to do, and they were ready to take on peace. The other huge change, I would say, besides devastating defeat, was the loss of empire. In the 1940s and 1950s, Britain lost its colonies, and it was a huge adjustment for England to begin to think of itself as a single little country bereft of empire. And Japan had colonized Taiwan. They had colonized Korea. They had moved into Manchuria and taken over Manchuria in 1931. They had occupied parts of China. In Shanghai, they had a very large community there that dominated parts of Shanghai. And so they really had an empire. In a strange way, they were more cosmopolitan because they occupied other countries than they were after the war. Because in Taiwan, there were people who thought of themselves as Japanese. They learned Japanese in school, and they were not first-class citizens, but they were citizens of the Japanese Empire, in the same way in Korea, in the same way in Manchuria. So all these people, in a way, were Japanese. It was a more cosmopolitan vision of what it meant to be Japanese. There were first-class and second-class citizens, but they were, after all, citizens of Japan, educated in Japanese language, and they took part. And suddenly that was bereft. And at the time of the end of World War II, there were about almost 1 million Japanese living in Taiwan. And between Manchuria and, I'm sorry, almost 1 million in Korea, and between Taiwan and Manchuria, there were another almost 1 million. So all those people had to come home, and the Japanese, who had been the victimizers until 1945, suddenly became the victims. There were not enough ships to bring Japanese back to the homeland. There was something like 6-7 million Japanese abroad at the time of 1945 out of a population of 70 million people. And the soldiers, of course, got first priority. And when the Japanese soldiers left and the Chinese took over in 1945 right away, the Japanese were lost, and particularly in Manchuria, where there were almost 1 million Japanese living. They were forlorn. Some people estimated 100,000, up to 200,000 died from hunger. There was nobody looking after them. And in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of the people from Manchuria who made it back to Japan wrote novels, and there were movies that had a huge impact of the sorrow. Some of them, the Japanese kids who were orphaned in Manchuria, were adopted by Chinese families. A few Japanese who stayed married Chinese, but they were devastated, and so they came back. And the Koreans and the Taiwanese and the Manchurians who had become almost Japanese citizens were suddenly also without a country. In Taiwan, they spoke Japanese, and yet when Chiang Kai-shek's troops came in, they were in the Chinese society and they were Chinese, and yet in culture and everything that they had learned, they were Japanese. And particularly when the soldiers from Chiang Kai-shek's forces tried to clamp down and get control over the local population, a lot of the local population said the Japanese weren't that bad. Of course, there was quite a difference between the people who were in Taiwan and those who were in Korea. Korea had been a real country, and there had been a national loyalty. And so when the Japanese occupied it, there had always been a national organized resistance, and the tension remained very great throughout the occupation. In Taiwan, the Japanese came in so strong and so tough that in the first 2 or 3 years, they mowed down all the resistance. And from the late 1890s, it was basically a pretty pacifist country. And the people, in a sense, became Japanese. They had never really been, not even a province, except for a few years just before the Sino-Japanese War. They were only a prefecture, which is part of a province. So there wasn't any national rallying card against Japanese, and they became almost like Japanese. So that continues to complicate the relations between China and Japan today. Another important development right after 1945 was the race for Japanese technology in Manchuria. The Japanese had come in to develop industry in Manchuria in the 1930s, and they made that a huge industrial base for carrying on the war. And so after the war, by far the most industrialized part of China was in the what the Japanese called Manchuria and what the Chinese called their northeast, the three provinces, Jilin, Liaoning, and Heilongjiang. And in those three provinces, there was an enormous amount of industrial goods. The Russians came in to Manchuria just before the end of the war. And of course, they took a lot of the industrial goods with them. The Japanese couldn't take much back. And what was left became, in a way, the China's industrial base after 1949. And when the Russians turned around in the 1950s, became the ally of China, and they were helping build up industry, they did it largely on the base of what the Japanese had left before that time. So there was a Japanese industrial base, and one of the Japanese who played a role in sort of keeping the industry going, Takasaki Tatsunosuke, was even asked to help supply parts for a lot of those factories that were still needed to keep them going. So there was, in a sense, an enormous industrial base for the time. Now, of course, it was tiny by comparison with the modern industrial bases. But at the time, it was very large and very significant compared to what was available elsewhere. So that's sort of the early period of the late 1940s, early 1950s, gives you a flavor of some of the things that were happening, the enormous Japanese defeat, of course, the communist victory in China, where they set up their own government. Now, during the period after 1945, when the American-led occupation of Japan was getting started, our initial response was to try to keep Japan down. They had big industry and they had supported the war effort, and the Zaibatsu, large combines, were supporting the war industry, and so we were trying to tear everything down and keep Japan kind of a poor place. But in 1947, there was what the Japanese call a reverse course. So instead of just keeping the Japanese down and not letting them have any military force, we wanted them as, why in 1947 did that change? It was because of the Cold War. And China was beginning to link up with the Soviet Union, becoming communist. And so by the Korean War, Japan was now becoming America's ally against the Cold War from the Russians and the Chinese. So the Americans did not want Japan to trade much with China. The Japanese in the 1930s, who were talking about moving abroad to Manchuria and other places, said that our place is so small, we don't have enough agriculture, we don't have enough resources, minerals, we need larger land. And so after World War II, that same view was held by many Japanese leaders. They needed a broader space to carry out their activities, their agriculture, their industry. And so they wanted to carry on additional trade with China. But the American occupation held that down. We kept that down to a very tiny base. And so right up until Kissinger and Nixon went to China in 1971, we were very down on Japan for having much contact with China. And so all those Japanese who hoped to get food from China had to rely on United States aid and American agriculture. And the first year or two after the war, actually, there were quite a few Japanese who died of hunger. The first year or two, there really were not enough resources. But by the time American agricultural aid was coming in a fairly big way by 47, 48, then the starvation had basically been eliminated in Japan. But Japan still had very few resources. They had wanted more contact with China, even though they had occupied China and had been the enemy country. And the Chinese certainly thought of the Japanese as enemies. Still, they wanted to carry on some trade, and it was a very minor scale. However, within the mainstream of Japan's politics and economics, there was a tiny group that held up economic relations with China. And there was a tiny contact between them. In 1955, Zhou Enlai went to the Bandung Conference, where he was trying at that time to make China play a larger peaceful role in the world. And in Bandung, he met some Japanese. And the Japanese he met was Takasaki Tatsunosuke, who had been head of the Manchurian industry from 1942 and had stayed throughout the war. And even after the war, he remained to try to keep relations between the Chinese and the Japanese who stayed there for a year or two after the war. He didn't run away. He stayed, and he became the head of the Japanese public. Well, he was at that meeting in Bandung, and Zhou Enlai introduced him to a Chinese guy named Liao Chengzhi. Liao Chengzhi was the son of Liao Zhongkai, who was a leader after Sun Yat-sen and was even a possible successor to Sun Yat-sen, who had gone to Japan in the 19 teens and the 20s and was quite a well-to-do person. And his son, Liao Chengzhi, attended the Japanese school, a very good private school in Japan. So Liao Chengzhi then went to back and forth, but he also spent a year or two at Waseda University as a student. And he was at the Bandung meeting. And Zhou Enlai introduced the two of them. And they were not able to accomplish much right in 1955 because the United States was too strong against it. But they kept in touch. Liao Chengzhi was the only Japanese-speaking Chinese who became a member of the Politburo and had played an extraordinarily important role in welcoming all Japanese who came to China. He lived until 1983. And during the time when 70s and 80s, when things began to warm up in the relationship, he was almost always at the top of the welcoming committee in China for the Japanese who went there. And he had a good sense of humor, and he was very wise. And Takasaki was also a very interesting industrialist. I have a little piece on him at the back of my book where I talk about the biographies of several people. He had gone, as I say, to Manchuria in 1942 and was in charge of industry and stayed through the war and the first years afterwards. And so the two of them signed a memorandum on behalf of their government in 1961 that became a basis for a small amount of trade, but it wasn't a great deal of trade. So that continued. And the United States kept saying to Japan, you're not to have too much trade with China. It happened that Prime Minister Sato in the 1960s and President Richard Nixon didn't get along very well. President Sato, Nixon thought, had made a promise that he was going to hold back exports. Nixon had what we called a Southern strategy of trying to get support in the South where he would get the necessary votes to win the election. And textiles was very important to the South at that time, North Carolina and other Southern states. Japan was coming along very strong in textiles in those days. And from Nixon's point of view, Sato didn't keep his promise of keeping down exports enough. And Nixon and Kissinger on his behalf were quite furious at the Japanese for not doing more. So their relationship was pretty bad. And The United States was beginning to have some secret talks with China through the Warsaw connection. The Warsaw Embassy was the place that Chinese representatives, the United States representatives, could meet even during the Cold War. And they didn't meet often, but there were some talks there that were beginning to lead to the Japanese didn't have full intelligence, but they thought they might begin to develop, and they were afraid that the United States would have contact with China before Japan did. So Nixon and Kissinger promised Japan that they would let Japan know before we took any steps. Well, they didn't keep their promise. And as you know, the story of Kissinger going from Pakistan and flying to Beijing in 1971, and then of the Nixon visit to Beijing in early 1972, where we established and opened the door, and the Japanese were left completely outside. By the time Kissinger had visited in 71, and the Japanese heard about it, they were, of course, absolutely furious. And the relationship was one of the worst U.S.-Japan relationship periods of any period since World War II. And so what happened was, once they opened the door, they'd been telling Japan not to have contact with China, not to trade much. Japan was furious and wanted to move quickly to establish better relations with China. Well, Prime Minister Sato had made it a point of being pretty nasty to China. He didn't like China very well. And it was very clear that Chinese were not going to accept him in forming relationships, and the Japanese felt they needed to do something. Well, there was a person named Tanaka at that time who was in the Diet. And Tanaka was a very enterprising person he was the kind of politician who believed money would solve a lot of things. And some people would call it bribery or money politics. But he was a very skilled politician, and he was very forthright, and he believed in having contact with China. And so very quickly in late 71, just as soon as Kissinger had gone there, the Japanese began saying Tanaka should be our prime minister. And within a few months, Tanaka became the prime minister and was able to make a trip to China. And in order to catch up with China real quickly, they even went all the way within several months, all the complicated negotiations. They normalized relations. Tanaka flew to Beijing in the summer of 1972, and they formalized relations. They did that so quickly, they didn't have all the documents necessary for forming consulates and all the rules about exchange and goods and so forth. So it was not a very solid establishment of relations, but it was establishment of relationships. And so in 1972 already, Japan formed relations. Some of the Japanese businessmen thought, aha, America did that first because they wanted to get business in there first and beat us out. So we don't want that to happen. So they supported rushing, getting Japanese businesses into China in the early 1970s, and they did. So the relationships didn't develop very well. And China at that time was rifted by the Cultural Revolution. It had started before, and the things were in a mess. And so China was not really able to move ahead until with relationships after 1972, because until Mao died in 1976 and the Cultural Revolution ended. And after that time, then the Chinese, Deng Xiaoping, who I spent 10 years working on, I think is, of all the people in the 20th century, by the time I got through with my book, my research, I was convinced that nobody in the 20th century had an impact on global history the way Deng Xiaoping, because he turned China around and got it on the road to growth. And then China was from a poor little country after time of the Cultural Revolution. After 1978, when Deng came to power, suddenly grew into the power that's now rivaling the United States. And it was Deng Xiaoping that turned that corner. Well, Deng Xiaoping, when he, after 76, when Mao died, he gradually came to power. In early 1978, when he was beginning to get some power, he decides that he wants to go further with Japan. He realized that he needed Japanese help in order to industrialize, because Japan was nearby. They felt guilty about World War II, and even if they didn't call it reparations, they would do a lot to help China. So he got the Japanese to agree to come in, what they needed was a treaty on peace and friendship in order to do all the other things they had to do to form all the formal relations to really make the economy begin to develop and open up, and consulates and so forth. And he accomplished that very quickly. And he came to power really formally in December 1978. He still had a couple of steps to go, but it was 1978 at what they called the third plenum of the 11th Party Congress that he came to power. And at that time, just before that, 2 months before that, he went to Japan because he felt that when he came to power, he was going to need the economic help in Japan. He had the good fortune to have a lot of bright Chinese under him who did their homework. And so there were, while he was in Japan, he rode on the Shinkansen. At that time, of course, China had no fast rail. Now China has about half the fast rail of the entire world. But Deng decided they needed fast rail and rode on the Shinkansen. He also decided they need steel. They needed really modern steel. They produced in all of China about twice as much as one modern Japanese steel plant. So he visited Kimitsu in Japan, this modern steel plant, which became the basis for Baoshan in Shanghai, and worked with Inayama, the head of Japan Steel, in planning that. He also went down to Osaka, where he visited Matsushita Konosuke, the person who started Panasonic National Modern Tech. In those days, they didn't yet have computers, but they had electronic TV and other kind of electronic equipment that he was producing. So he had the foresight to form those relations with Japan. And so in the 1980s, Japan did help China an enormous amount in building industry. And the relationships really went on a kind of a boom throughout the 1980s. After Tiananmen incident in June 4th, 1989, the relationships soured a little, but of all the foreign countries that worked with China, the one that worked with them the best was Japan, because Japan still felt guilty over World War II. They felt they were a neighbor, we had to work with them. And so they were not as nasty as some of the Western countries in cutting off all relations. So the Japan from 1989 to 1992 played quite a role in trying to keep the door open when it wasn't open to Western countries, to China. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping felt that they were in trouble in China because the youth had supported the Tiananmen incident. They were not really patriotic, and they needed something to build up the Chinese patriotism. It was no longer the class struggle, it was patriotism, loyalty. And when they got going on the campaign to teach patriotism, patriotic education campaign in 1992, the item that worked best in getting patriotic Chinese was recalling World War II. And because they hated the Japanese, there were a lot of people alive. I remember when I first visited Germany in the 50s and thinking how nice the Germans were. How could these guys have been Nazis? And I felt the same way about Japan. You know, I went when I went to Japan in the 50s, Japanese I met were so kind and so quiet. I couldn't imagine how nasty they had been. And yet the truth is, they had been terrible during the war. They had been very cruel. And the Chinese hated them. And so it wasn't hard to whip up hatred toward the Japanese. And the propaganda department used a lot of modern techniques. They used movies. And one year there were almost 100 movies that were made showing World War II. You could go to Beijing during that period and you turn on the switch on the television. If the second or third station was not a World War II anti-Japanese movie, maybe the fourth one was. They were all over everywhere. And so the hatred toward Japan really grew. And the relationships really became just terrible. Then the peak of the horrible relations was the year 2010. Adam, I'll try to finish within 3 or 4 minutes. I know you're concerned. When they were so tense at that time in 2010, 2012. And in a way, that was a turning point. From 1895 until 2010, in the relations between Japan and China, Japan was on top. But by 2010, China was again on top. The World Bank declared that year the Chinese economy was larger than Japan's. In 2008, at the global financial crisis, the West looked so bad that China began to have more confidence. It was also the Olympics, and China was beginning to feel even more proud than Tokyo was in 1964 when they had the Olympics. And so they were beginning to feel on top of things. And in a way, it was as if the Chinese were saying to Japan, look, we're on top now and you guys are on the bottom. I think there was a lot of national spirit that supported that sentiment. So by the time they got through in 1912, 12, 13, 14, it was really a terrible relationship. And since that time, the relationship has only gradually normalized. And I think that now we're beginning to get a more stable relationship. If I were writing a book today, of course, I would write it on the U.S. China relationship. But I wrote on the Japan-China relationship. But I think that today, if you think of the nature of the Far East, it's the United States, China, but Japan is extremely important. And when we always talk about U.S.-China relationship, I think we don't give enough emphasis to how important Japan is in this equation. I think there are a number of reasons why Japan can be especially important in this relationship. First of all, because they never, since 2010, they've not been on top, and they're much more polite and cautious. They don't yell at the Chinese like we do. Secondly, the Japanese trading companies have made a special point of learning Chinese customs that are all over, usually 10 different cities or so. They have local relationships, and they provide a link for Japanese small companies. And Japanese companies in general are very long-term in their thinking, so they don't give away too much modern technology that will make it difficult for them to stay for a long term. And Japan is also very close. So a guy from Tokyo or Osaka can fly on the morning plane, have lunch in Beijing or Shanghai, do some business, and get home by late afternoon. So I think those combinations make it possible for Japan to play a kind of important role when the United States and China relationship is so bad. The relationship with Japan and China is not that bad. The last few years, since Chinese have been traveling to Japan, they felt that the relationship is not that bad. They see the Japanese, they don't seem like the soldiers they saw in the movies in World War II. They seem polite and courteous and nice and clean, and a lot of things about Japanese society they begin to like. But the Japanese are still cautious. They see what the Chinese do in sending troops and ships and planes. They get near the Senkaku Island. They have remembered those anti-Japanese movies and the nastiness that their people have seen in China. And so I think the Japanese are going to remain loyal to the United States security relationship, but at the same time, they would like to improve relationships with China, but they will do so in a fairly cautious, careful way. So I think just as at the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, America pulled out, Japan kept it going. So I think that Japan has already begun to play a little larger role in the go-between between China and the United States, a dream they've had for a long time, never been able to realize. But there are elements of that dream that are now beginning to work. And I think that Japan can therefore, in this very tense, tight situation, begin to play a larger role. Well, I've had to race through a whole lot of things, Adam, but there's a quick overall of some of the main events of 1945 to 2020. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Ezra. That was a remarkably concise overview of 75 years of China-Japan relations in just 40 minutes. So I have just a couple of burning questions for you, pegged to current events, before we turn things over to our audience. In the meantime, folks, if you have a question for our speaker, please just submit it through the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Please do try to be as concise as possible, and do let us know in the message where in the world you're writing from, and I mean that literally. And apologies in advance if we don't have time to get to your specific question. We'll fit in as many as we can. So Professor Vogel, thank you again for a wonderful talk. My first question for you is pegged to the major news story in Japan this week, and that is that Prime Minister Abe's successor has just been decided, and this effectively brings to an end the longest and arguably most stable prime ministership in Japanese history. You identified 2010 as a major turning point in China-Japan relations. And just to remind our audience, and as you noted, Abe came into office in December 2012 in the middle of a major deterioration in China-Japan relations, in large part because of an escalation of tensions in the East China Sea. And partially as a result, you'll recall, for the first 2 years, Chinese leaders basically refused to meet with him or even engage in robust diplomacy with Japan at lower levels. And it wasn't until 2014 in November at the APEC summit that they were able to meet on the sidelines for, I think, about half an hour. So here's my question for you. Now, with the benefit of 8 years of hindsight, what do you think Abe's term will be most remembered for? And specifically, what do you think will be the primary legacy of Prime Minister Abe as it concerns Japan's relations with China?
Well, I think that the stability of Japan after changing prime ministers year after year, that prime minister should stay in long and that should have fairly stable relationships with the United States under difficult times will be what he'll be remembered for. And I think the relationship with China is also very important. When the socialists came to power, Hatoyama Yukio visited Beijing before he visited everybody else. And he wanted to have better relations with China than with
sorry, Ezra, you mean the DPP, right?
Yes. What did I say?
I'm sorry, the DPJ. You said the socialists. So the Democratic Party of Japan.
Right. I'm sorry. The Democratic Party of Japan and Hatoyama Yukio. When he came to power, he wanted to have better relations with China. But it ended up his relationships were the worst. And he didn't have the support of the people. I think what Abe did was that he visited Yasukuni before he took office. So people knew where he stood. He was a patriot. I mean, just as in the United States, it took Nixon, a conservative, to have the support to develop relationship with China. Because if a liberal, soft, fuzzy Democrat had done that, it wouldn't have had the public support and been able to do it. I think Abe, by establishing his nationalist credentials, was then able to be quite pragmatic in stabilizing relations with China. So I think that after 2010, 2012, when it was the opposition party was in power during the most difficult time. It was Abe with a nationalist program and solid nationalist credentials who was able to stabilize and develop good relations. Now, I wouldn't say good, but workable relations with China.
Would you agree with, I think it's Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro, who was Prime Minister from 01 to 06. He's, and I'm paraphrasing here, that one of the best ways to have a healthy, constructive relationship with China is to have a very, very strong, healthy relationship with the United States. Would you agree that Abe more or less agrees with that maximum?
I do, although I think the world is changing. I think that during the Trump era, when relations between the Chinese and the United States has become so bad, that I think there is a little more room for maneuver for Japan. And Japan began in the 1950s and 60s as you can say Ardeshi. They were under our wing. And I think now Japan can become a little more independent. So I think they will work hard to keep a fundamental security relationship with the United States, but I think they may begin to have a little more independence. And I think that's going to be the new era, and it will require some new footwork on the part of all the countries to make it work.
Okay. So my next question follows from the previous one, but you set it up beautifully. It's forward-looking. So I want to ask about the issues and policies you think leaders should prioritize going forward. And so as you've just noted, Japan-China relations today remain tense, but they're more stable than they were. Whereas in stark contrast, U.S.-China relations, which are a major factor in ties between Tokyo and Beijing, are arguably the worst they've been in decades. So no one knows how the U.S. presidential election will play out in a few weeks, but we do know that Xi Jinping will almost certainly be in power for most, if not all, of the next U.S. administration. And we now know who will succeed Prime Minister Abe in Japan. So let me ask you this. If on January 21st, you could get the next US president, Xi Jinping and Suga Yoshihide, together for tea in your living room in Cambridge, and they all committed to listening to you for just 5 minutes, what would you want to say to them during that time? What advice would you want to give them based on the lessons learned, not just from the research you did for this book, but as a student of Japan and China for your entire career?
First of all, Suga, I think is a good listener, and I wouldn't be speaking to him because I don't think he's a prime mover. I think he was a wonderful chief of staff, and he will adjust, but I don't think of him as an initiator. So if I had those 5 minutes, I would be talking primarily to somebody like Biden, or if I were talking, for example, to Trump, I think there wouldn't be much chance of his listening anyhow. So I wouldn't have much to say if it were Trump. If it were Biden, then, and it were Xi Jinping, I would say to Xi Jinping, China is now much stronger. You've made yourself very assertive. You've done a good job of setting up the Belt and Road Initiative. You've developed your economy. We realize things are very difficult, but we think that now that in order to get along in the world, now that you've achieved such status, that you need to find ways to come on softer. If you see that what's happening now in Europe and Southeast Asia and India, that you've come on so assertive that you're getting a lot of negative reaction. And I hope you'll find a way to keep China strong, but that I think you would find it in your interest in the long run to follow the policies of making more adjustments to the people of Southeast Asia, India, and even the United States. What I would say to Biden is that the people who wrote that we made a mistake on engagement were just wrong. Engagement has had a tremendous impact in China. And there are a lot of Chinese who would like to work with the United States. And given the American mood, you can't move too quickly, but you can do things to stabilize the relationship. You can begin to uh, stabilize the trade relationship. The trade war is not working. It's impossible to disentangle. You have to be prepared to use some sanctions because the Chinese have a system now of government help to industry and we don't. And that when China is now strong, it's not going to be easy to deal with. So you have to have some kind of response to deal with that. So anyhow, that's the essence of the message I would give to those two people.
So who would you recommend engaging on the Japanese side? It seems like you don't envision future Prime Minister Suga as a mover and shaker or proactive leader, at least in foreign policy. Is that what you were implying with your remarks?
Oh, he's a very good team player. And I think he will work with other Japanese, and I think he will work with others. But I don't think he's a prime mover. He will judge the situation. He will talk to other people, but he won't be a strong initiator the way that the United States and Xi Jinping will be.
So just to clarify on this point, is it an argument about Japan's ability to be an active contributor to this, or is it specifically about the person of Suga? And if it's the latter, who would you recommend that people engage in Japan?
I think Suga can engage with China and work with them. And I've met Suga several times, and he's a very thoughtful, good person, reliable, doesn't get too excited. He's worked under Abe. He's been a supporter for Abe. I think that what Suga, in my hunch is, will be an interim president of Japan. Well, prime minister will not probably last too long. I think that the two young people, Kono Taro and Koizumi, are promising, and I think they would be the kind who would take more initiative in really working with Japan, trying to work independence. And so I think probably to expect new strong action from Japan or a strong point of view, you may have to wait till that generation. I think Suga is a good caretaker. He will keep up the Abe program. He's solid. He gets along with people. He's sensible. But I don't think, as far as I have seen, I haven't seen that he's a real forceful initiator.
Okay. So just to clarify for our audience, Kono Taro is the current defense minister and former foreign minister, and Koizumi Shinjiro is the son of the former Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro.
I've had the pleasure of meeting both of them, and they both spent time in the United States, speak English. Mm-hmm. They're very bright. They're very thoughtful. I've been very impressed how both of them are studying and learning, and I think they will be able to take part in international conversations and discussions in a way that maybe nobody since Miyazawa has been able to do. You know, it has a combination of English and understanding of international issues that Nakasone could do it with translator, but I think Nakasone, since Nakasone, nobody has had sort of the kind of subtle understanding of the outside world that those two, Kono and Koizumi, have. And so I think there's great promise in those two.
All right, well, thank you, Ezra. We've now crossed the 9 o'clock mark, so it's time to open things up to our audience. Now, I may edit some questions down for clarity and brevity, but I'll try to capture their basic spirit. So let me see. Our first question comes from a student here at Indiana University who asked, in the course of your research, did you encounter anything that surprised you or fundamentally changed your perspective on any aspect of China-Japan relations?
There were a lot of things I didn't know. I hadn't thought through, for example, one of the things I talked about today was the end of empire and what that meant and how deep that was. I was surprised how some people like Takasaki Tatsunosuke played such a key role in the subtleties of the contact between a lot of Chinese and Japanese. I think maybe it's because the language and the history and the culture are so similar that some of the Japanese have a much more subtle, nuanced understanding of China than we do, we Americans do. The ability in language. There are a lot of little one thing that surprised me, for example, the main place in China that produced people working in China was the Toa Doben Shu in Shanghai. And that was a wonderful training school. After World War II, the Americans didn't allow that because they thought to be revived in Japan, because we were afraid it was too militaristic. And most of the people who were there, well, not most, but a significant number, decided to go to Aichi University. And, and in my tour after this book came out, I went to Aichi University. I was amazed at the depth of work on China going on at Aichi University by that tradition that comes from those people who had worked in China before World War II. So I guess that's one thing that surprised me is the depth of knowledge and contact. A lot of it's detailed, but knowing the language and so forth, the depth of contact that kept going all during the time when the relations between the two leaders of the country were all that bad. And I think that in a way, maybe that says something about U.S. China relations now. There are a lot of contacts that are still going between Chinese and Americans, not only in business, but in public health and other areas that are going on right now when we say the relationships are so awful. So I guess that's one thing that surprised me.
Okay, thank you. Our next question comes to us from a journalist who works out of the Beijing Bureau of Bloomberg in James Mager. He says, you say that the bilateral relationship has gradually stabilized and normalized. However, there's been no progress on any of the headline bilateral disputes between Japan and China, the East China Sea gas fields, the Senkaku's WWII, and in fact, China looks to be changing the status quo on those. What evidence do you see that relations will improve, and what do you think will be the result of the increasing US-China tension and suspicion?
We don't know, and it's true that the relations over the Senkaku Diaoyuidao are still very serious, and the Chinese are still sending in a lot of ships, and even though they've stabilized at a moderately high degree of tension over the Diaoyuidao Senkaku. The hope, of course, was before our COVID problem came, was that Xi Jinping would visit Japan during the cherry blossom season this year. And because of coronavirus, he wasn't able to do that. I think if he is able to visit, we may have some progress and some stabilization. I think the Chinese still want Japan to be a little uncomfortable, and they do want to keep advancing their military power in the East and South China Sea. So when I say stable, it's a relative term, and there's still a problem that could arise.
Okay, all right, thank you. So we've taken one question from China. Now let's move our way east to, I believe, Japan, although no location is identified if this is who I think it is. As the relative power between Japan and China becomes, the gap becomes larger both economically and militarily. And naturally, there is less of a need for the Chinese public to see Japan as a threat or even a rival. Do you think public sentiment towards Japan and China may soften in a significant and permanent way? The author of this question is Nagayama Daisuke.
This has already begun to happen because of the Chinese visitors to Japan. In 2010, if I remember, there were about 1 million or so Chinese who visited Japan each year. In 2018, it was up to over 8 million. When they come back from Japan, they've had remarkably good impressions. And so I think the chances are of China and there are quite a few Chinese feel we worked so hard now, we've got over our economic basic problems. Now the question is, how do we have a more comfortable style of life? How do we have a little more relaxation, a little more art, a little more literature, visiting, tourism, and Japan looks like a more comfortable society. So I think if you said to a lot of Chinese now, would you rather take America as a model of something you'd be more like a Japan? I think a lot of them would say Japan because it has Eastern culture. The people are not as nasty and arrogant as Americans are, and they're rather friendly and open. So I really think that change has already taken place. Of course, the generation that grew up on those World War II movies don't forget that completely. But the psychologists I've studied say that when you have your own personal experience, you don't change as easily. But when you've been told something, then the things change. You find more change. And it wasn't, I think the generation that experienced the Japanese in World War II, they're not going to change that easily. Of course, they're dying off now. But I think the ones that learned about it from movies, now when they see things are different, I think quite a few of them can change significantly.
And I'd note also that if you look at public opinion polling after the Senkaku or Diaoyu dispute really escalated in 2012, there's a sharp drop off in public sentiment toward the other in both China and Japan. But in recent years, public sentiment toward Japan has recovered quite significantly. It's still not net positive, but it's close in some polls. And yet in Japan, that hasn't happened at all. So there's a growing gap in views of the other, if you will. All right, thank you. So our next question comes from our November speaker in the series, Professor Jennifer Lin from Dartmouth College. So she says, hi from Hanover. Thank you, Professor Vogel. My question is, to what extent do you think recent tensions in China-Japan relations were driven by Abe and his family's legacy? And thus, how much can we hope things might improve under a different leader? She specifically references Suga-san.
Between Japan and China?
Yes, I believe the question is from Japan and China.
I don't think that things got that much work under Abe. I think that once I think they stabilized, and I think that if anything, Suga would be like to continue to improve relations with China. And I think the big question now is, the immediate one is whether Xi Jinping's visit to Japan will come off, because I think if they're able to work that out and have him visit, then I think the whole atmosphere of the visit in both places would be more forward-looking. So I think that is the biggest thing. I don't think there's any big change in say security relationships or basic political issues that is likely to change over that. But I do think that the Japanese will continue to carry on businesses in China, and they haven't pulled them out. They're not ready to decouple. And surprisingly, I think American businesses in China are not decoupling as much as you might guess from the reading of the American newspapers.
Okay. All right, so our next question comes from a student, and we have time for about one or two more questions. And this is about Taiwan's democratization and its impact on relations between Tokyo and Beijing. And the student writes, in your book, you identify 1992 as a major transition year between a, quote, golden age in PRC-Japan relations in the 1980s and what you later called the, quote, deterioration that unfolded from 1992 to 2018. Another major development that occurred in the 1990s was the rapid acceleration of Taiwan's democratization, which arguably kicked into high gear in 1992 and especially after 1996. Many scholars point to Taiwan's democratization as causing a major change in the way that U.S. policymakers view Taiwan, as well as Taiwan's importance to U.S. interests and values. In your view, to what extent has Taiwan's emergence as a liberal democracy in the 1990s and 2000s affected China-Japan relations this century?
I don't think it's the democracy that's changed Beijing's attitude toward Taiwan. I think it's the last couple of years, American Congress people who are beginning to talk of relationships with Taiwan that are quite different than the agreements that the American government made with China over Taiwan, that we would not raise. I think Beijing, when we normalized relationships with the United States, made a number of conditions that we not give too much high-level recognition to Taiwan. And I think it's the fact that Americans have begun to do those things. And it's also, I think, the fact that the Chinese mood has changed so much. I think during the Ma Ying-jeou period, there was still quite a bit of hope that the so-called 82 consensus, I think, when Taiwan and Gu Jinfu and leader met with the Wang Daohan. And I think there was a hope at that time of better relations. But now that Taiwan identification has gone so much with localism, I think that's the problem. It's not the fact that Taiwan has gone democratic.
We'll end with full circle, coming back to a student from Bloomington. And how do you foresee the role of human rights issues playing out in Japan-China relations? Will it affect how Japan treats either China and the US? It might be too early to tell right now, but if the US does continue to raise issues about human rights in China, do you think Japan will feel pressure to take any form of public action, or perhaps even the student writes sever some ties with China? Perhaps that's a reference to impose sanctions on Chinese companies or the like.
Well, I have a different view on the human rights issue than some Americans. I think when we just complain about human rights and then try to use sanctions, that China resists very strongly. They're very frightened. And if we make a big fuss about Hong Kong, they will feel they need to clamp down even further. I think the way that we should express our opinion is in the public opinion. I think China does not like to lose face. I think we should, on human rights issue, not try to use sanctions, but we should use shaming. We should, in all kinds of international fora in this country and with meetings with the Chinese, just raise the issue. I think that would have much more positive effect on the people in China who are affected. I think that the attempt to use pressure has been counterproductive in terms of what actually happens to the people. When we complain about once in a while, one particular person might get by, but in Xinjiang, it has not helped, and Hong Kong has not helped. I think the Japanese have been more cautious on human rights in terms of what they do publicly. They realize that they did a lot of bad things in World War II. They realize that China is very sensitive. And so they mention human rights, but they don't push it, and they don't get on such a high platform, and don't try to use various kinds of sanctions that the United States uses. And I think that therefore would mean that the Chinese get less upset at the Japanese than at Americans over human rights issues.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been a tremendous privilege and honor. Thank you so much, Ezra, for making time for us. We had nearly 160 people on the call today, and that's just a testament to your influence and reputation. So thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen on the call, I strongly recommend that you pick up the book that you see over my left shoulder. There are anecdotes on various things. So for example, Japan's response to Tiananmen in 1989, which touches on this human rights issue. And Japan was the first mover to kind of loosen some of those restrictions. And any number of issues that Professor Vogel covered in his talk today are dealt with in great depth in this wonderful, wonderful book. So thank you all for joining us. And Professor Vogel, thank you again for making time to be with us virtually here in Bloomington, Indiana.
I'm sorry I wasn't able to come in person, and this is the next best thing. So
Hopefully we'll
a
get
lot
you
of luck.
back
I
sometime
was
soon.
going to also mention that I think that the University of Indiana now is a great group of China people. I think Gardner Bovington and Sarah Friedman and Adam Liff. We have a young woman from Harvard, Hillary Holbrow, who is coming in China and Japanese sociology. So I think that China and Japan are very well represented in Indiana studies, and I wish you great luck in continuing your work in the field.
Thank you so much. And Jason Wu, Wendy Loitert, we've hired 2 more China-focused political scientists with perhaps more to be announced in the coming years. So please send us your students. We'd love to work with them. So thank you again, and good night, everybody. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.